Vice President Harris announced on Tuesday that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is her choice for vice presidential nominee. Walz is supposed to provide a Midwestern moral booster shot for the Harris presidential campaign, but Walz's record doesn't match his pious pretensions. Back in 2020, after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, riots broke out, but Walz and other Democratic politicians turned a blind eye to the carnage. After the riots ended, Walz turned a blind eye to Somali racketeers plundering hundreds of millions of tax dollars. Governor Walz last week sneered that Republicans don't know anything about family values. Family values means feeding children. But do politicians deserve applause for government programs that don't feed anyone? Walz sounded more clueless than Biden. Walz has falsely claimed that his agency staff deserved applause for finding out about the biggest COVID fraud in the nation, Minnesota's $250 million Feeding Our Future scandal. But thanks to Walz's failure, the government paid for 100 million meals the children never received during the COVID pandemic. And it was the FBI that sounded the alert on the GHOST program long after Walz's appointees had buried evidence, ignored a deluge of complaints, or kowtowed to politically connected nonprofit groups. The Justice Department has charged 72 people in Minnesota with pilfering $250 million from federal child nutrition programs. 5 have been convicted by a jury, 18 have pled guilty. Many other cases are coming. This was not a gray area of skimming money off the top. As an FBI agent testified, almost none of this money was used to feed children. Instead, the participants in the scheme used it to purchase real estate, cars, and other luxury items. Some of the plundered cash ended up in the coffers of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, and other Democratic politicians. All but one of the fraudsters were members of Minnesota's large Somali population, a key voting bloc for Walz's Democratic Farmer Labor Party. A recent audit found that Walz's appointees at the State Department of Education created opportunities for fraud thanks to their totally inadequate oversight and ignored warning signs from Feeding Our Future even before the pandemic began. Walz's administration was swindled by a scheme that even a Minnesota village idiot could have detected. Tax dollars were pilfered using a list of phony recipients generated by the website titled listofrandomnames.com. Feeding Our Future pocketed federal funds for feeding children named Serious Problem, Friday donations, and Unique Problem. At least none of the kids were named Take the Money and Run. There was one restaurant in Minneapolis that claimed to be serving more meals to children under this program than all the city schools in Minneapolis had. But Walz's wizards never bothered to stop by and check out the location. Is the Feeding Our Future scandal a bellwether on how a woke Harris-Walz administration would tamper with evidence to give a get-out-of-jail-free card to favored groups? Starting in late 2020, state officials recognized problems and sought to end government funding for Feeding Our Future. But that nonprofit retaliated with a lawsuit claiming that the state government was discriminating against it for working with racial minorities. They also spurred a protest at the Minnesota Department of Education headquarters, people waving signs saying FOF feeds our kids, MDE, Minnesota Department of Education won't. Walz was absolutely afraid of their race card, according to Bill Glenn, an analyst with the Center for the American Experiment, a Minnesota think tank. After a skirmish in local court, the state government dropped this challenge and pretended that Feeding Our Future was just fine. Fraud? What fraud? In July 2021, Walz presented the Outstanding Refugee Award to a lady who was subsequently indicted for bribery, money laundering, conspiracy to commit bribery, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud tied to Feeding Our Future. The state attorney general in Minnesota recently compelled a nonprofit to fire that lady for misuse of government funds. The Walz administration largely ignored the scandal until the FBI conducted raids in Minnesota in early 2022. After those raids made headlines in the New York Times, the Walz people finally started to pay attention. But some Somalis still felt entitled to legal impunity after those raids. In June, during the federal trial of the first batch of defendants, someone dropped off a Hallmark gift bag with $120,000 in cash at the home of one of the jurors. Why is it nobody ever gives me those kind of Hallmark gift bags. 5 people have been arrested in that bribery scheme, and 1 person has pled guilty. But Governor Walz is blameless, at least according to Governor Walz. In September 2022, Walz placed all the fault on the swindlers. What I'm angry about and can't stand is these people are criminals who did this. Were they obliged to turn themselves in and publicly confess, or what? After the first guilty verdicts from the jury came in June, Walz insisted that no state official had done anything wrong. There is not a single state employee that was implicated in doing anything that was illegal. Maybe that $250 million stole itself? Walz shrugged off the scandal. We can always do better. Will voters feel the same way? It will be fascinating to see whether the Feeding Our Future debacle becomes the prototype for mental and moral paralysis in the Harris-Walz administration. And we'll see if the next president grants Hunter Biden-style automatic immunity to millions of potential offenders who are politically favored.